Welcome, comrades. Welcome to Workers' World Party's weekly webinar, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the world gather to strategize, to analyze, and to build the struggle for a workers' world. Tonight, we will be focusing on the 2020 US election, the growing crisis between the two parties of the ruling class, and the question of whether white supremacist Donald Trump will steal the election. My name is Megan. I am with the Philadelphia branch of Workers' World Party, and I use they, them pronouns. I have the honor of hosting tonight's webinar, and we have decided to try out a bit of a different format tonight. I will be interviewing Workers' World Party's first secretary, Larry Holmes, and asking him about the party's analysis of this current election crisis, on top of the pandemic in which over 1 million have passed, and in the midst of the largest protest movement in US history, the current Black Lives Matter uprising. Before I introduce Larry, I want to remind all that while most people are watching on Zoom, if you can take a second to go to Workers' World Party's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Workers World Party, and share this live video with your friends and in your Facebook groups and pages, that would help us enormously to reach more members of our class. And we also encourage you to share your comments on Twitter at Workers World. So for all of you on Zoom as well, please add your pronouns and city to your name so that we can refer to you correctly when you ask questions or type in the chat. We will have time to take a few questions for Larry in about 30 minutes after the initial discussion. So now let's welcome Larry. Larry Holmes is the first secretary of Workers' World Party. And Larry might give a bit of an introduction, but we're really just going to jump right into the questions. So for Larry, our first sort of framing question here is to look at your most recent analysis for Workers' World newspaper in your article titled "The Left, the Election Crisis, and the, quote, elephant in the room." And this discusses the political crisis of the ruling class, the upcoming election, and what our class can do to address this crisis. So there's a few guiding questions. What do we mean when we say election crisis? What is the elephant in the room that the title of the article refers to? And why is it an elephant in the room? Thank you, Larry.
And hello, everyone. And thank you, comrade. Everybody who thinks about the elections, and certainly a lot of progressive, leftist, revolutionary, radical people are worried about the elections, and even to the extent that the elections might be the basis for some kind of serious fascist activity if Trump loses the election but refuses to leave office. And whatever that may spark, it seems to me that we shouldn't be surprised if he tries to pull something like that, because he can't deal with losing, and if he does lose, he'll probably try to do something to justify his tenure and his initial election, not wanting to just be defeated. And the best thing for him to do, the thing that he seems most inclined to do, is to give a signal to the right-wing and neo-fascist forces, some of whom have arms and who are training literally to do something. So we are entering a new and dangerous period before, during, and after the election. The point I made in my article is that while on the left, we're trying to see what we can do to help. There are groups that are organizing people to go to the polls as voter defenders because Trump has called on his supporters to go to the polls and basically harass people. And I think they'll be looking mostly for Black and brown people. So it's a racist threat, no different than what was done in the South, after the Reconstruction, when Black people for the first time, freed slaves, were voting, but the Ku Klux Klan would go to the polls and ensure that black people somehow didn't end up voting. Uh, I posed the question, what is the working class going to do? And I did it because under historically normal circumstances or something like that, we as Marxists, as Leninists, as people who are devoted to the working class, as people who see the working class as the game changer, and ultimately as the global social agent that can end capitalism and bring about socialism, what are they going to do to distinguish themselves and to defend their class interests uh, in this election crisis, which is going to take place in about a month? And I said, nobody's expecting them to do anything. People are probably not asking that question because it seems irrelevant. Because the unfortunate fact at the moment is that the working class in the United States and elsewhere, perhaps more acutely and longly in the United States, is not organized as a class. Politically, uh, any other way, it is uh, through the labor movement tied to one of the big, mostly tied to one of the big bourgeois parties, the Democratic Party. So the only way that most workers are going to distinguish themselves is to probably vote for Biden and Harris. And I pointed this out because this is a problem. This is a problem for all of us who still believe that the working class is the social agent for revolutionary change around the world. Uh, I would not be surprised uh, if you talk to many young militants who have been staying in the streets in Portland, in Kenosha, and elsewhere. If you ask them what the working class is going to do or what the labor movement is going to do, and they might look at you and say, "The labor movement? What do they ever do? They seem like the status quo." You know, what can we do to change that? And I believe that we can. I believe that we have to do that. I believe that this crisis is a warning for us in terms of the work we have to do as revolutionaries in finding a way, finding a way to raise the working class up to the next state, a state of awareness of itself as a class, state of independence from the capitalist parties, and a state of realizing they have to engage in class struggle to defend themselves against all manner of attacks that will put their existence into question. Uh, the question is, how can that be done? Uh, I also say that, if the working class is not able to do that, perhaps not in this crisis, which will be here and go, but uh, ultimately and ASAP, as soon as possible, uh, this is when we have to worry about fascism. Uh, the fascist threat comes from the reality that capitalism is falling apart. The wheels are falling apart. Uh, and the COVID-19 pandemic has sped up that process. Uh, and there's tension and disagreement and instability within the ruling class over this. Uh, that's why the elections is really not about Trump. Trump's a symptom of it. Trump's a symptom of how deep the political crisis is. Nobody like Trump who comes off like Trump would have been elected, which is not to say that they're all not like Trump. I'm talking about all the bourgeois politicians for the most part. It's just they don't say what he says in public. The fact that he says it in public, the fact that he acts like a fascist demagogue in public and openly divides people on the basis of racism, defending white supremacy, that's symptomatic of crisis. Crisis is crisis of the system, which is dying and coming to an end. So it's an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for the working class to get itself together. But if the working class doesn't, there are some desperate elements in the ruling class who may be attracted to trying to fix the crisis on the basis of some kind of fascism, some level of fascism. Uh, so the solution to that is not merely voting for the Democrats. It's the working class getting its act together, both organizationally and politically.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful, comrade. And it kind of leads me into, leads us into another question, which is, the question of the role of the Democratic Party here. Some people sort of talk about harm reduction as a reason to vote for Biden, and there's this persistent lesser of two evils narrative, and it feels like we just keep voting for the lesser of two evils. And so I'm wondering, what is the party's take on the role of the Democratic Party? Can they stop the rise of fascism and white supremacy and the collapse of capitalism? And what is their role here?
Well, first we need to establish that even as socialist revolutionaries, we are not angry or frustrated with many millions of workers who will vote, if they can vote, for the Democrats next month. They see no other alternative, and many of them are scared of Trump, especially if you are people of color, women, LGBTQ people, people who are progressive, and they will vote for just about anyone to get Trump out. But while we say that, we have to tell them the truth. And the truth is that the Democratic Party is dangerous for the working class. It's dangerous because what it has failed to do always, but especially in recent years, is to defend the interests of the workers, those workers who once had a union wage, $25 an hour, more or less what appeared to be a guaranteed job, good healthcare benefits, good retirement benefits, representation because they were members of a union. All that's being pushed back. Fewer and fewer workers are organized. The Democrats went hook, line, and sinker for capitalist globalization, for what some people call neoliberalism, for austerity, privatization of hospitals, cutting back on all social services. And what this in effect did, especially under Obama, under Clinton 20 years ago, is to throw the working class under the bus. These are the things that laid the basis for a demagogue like Trump come to power. The same thing is true in other countries around the world. While there's a big fascist development in countries like Germany and in France, it's because the social democratic parties, which were supposed to defend the interests of the workers, who were convinced by the bourgeoisie that no, we've got to cut wages, we've got to bust unions, we've got to cut health care, we've got to cut assistance to the poor, to the homeless, we've got to cut assistance to the retired, and they said, well, we can't fight it because, we accept capitalism, we're trying to reform it, but we can't hold on to these reforms. And millions of workers, not only in Europe, but all over the world, millions upon millions of workers became disillusioned with the social democratic parties. Just the same way with millions of workers became disillusioned with the Democrats. And the Democrats clearly are not going to change. You see Biden. Biden represents the mainstream bourgeoisie. He's a bourgeois, Biden the wool capitalist politician. There's actually very little difference, aside from manner, between him and Trump. And they did this by, once again, not just once, but twice, preventing Bernie Sanders, who is a social democrat, which is not our flavor. We are more revolutionary than that. But from a point of view of comparisons to Biden, Bernie Sanders was talking to the working class, and it was comparatively progressive. the issues that he was raising. But the Democrats don't want to hear it. They not allow him to be the candidate, not just once, but twice. And this helps Trump and ultimately anyone in the ruling class who's interested in experimenting with fascism. So I think we should consider the Democratic Party, whether they win or lose, be in some ways, even more dangerous than Trump, because they claim to be our friend. Most of them are saying Black Lives Matters now. Matter of fact, if you listen to the mainstream news stations, you would think the Democrats were the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement. They've had it painted, on the sidewalk in Washington, maybe in Seattle, in New York, and stuff. This is what they do. They try to co-opt movements, smother them, and then kill them. But whatever happens next month in terms of the election, if radicals not allow him a serious be the candidate, not just one, and informed smother for the working class, and figure out a strategy of how we can take the working class in its present form and develop it and unify it in such a way that it becomes a powerful economic and social revolutionary force, first and foremost to defend its own interests, and then to do away with capitalism. The Democrats will continue by their throwing us under the bus to create the vacuum space. Somebody in the ruling class stoke white supremacy, divide us, and more dangerously, ultimately, experiment with fascism.
Absolutely, comrade. That's extremely incisive, and this question of how to interact with what to do with the Democratic Party right now, I think, is a difficult question because we don't have many options sort of presented to us in this mainstream narrative, and that sort of gets me thinking about Biden's picking Kamala Harris as his VP. And following this historic uprising against white supremacy and police brutality, and really affirming the power of Black people in this country and of our class to sort of rise up and make some real noise. And understandably, I think some people are excited about the nomination of Kamala Harris, a Black and South Asian woman. That's obviously unprecedented. The bar is pretty low in U.S. politics, but I think understandably some people are sort of excited about that, and that I think leads me to a sort of foundational question, but I think it's really important to raise in the context of this discussion, but also of our historical moment more generally. There's a sort of white working class mythos that is still very prevalent in U.S. political culture that sets up this opposition between class politics and identity politics. So when we refer to our class here, what exactly do we mean? And by looking to the working class, are we ignoring issues of identity?
Well, this may be the most important question to decipher. Even people who consider themselves militants in the working class struggle, who consider themselves socialists and revolutionaries, are arguing over class identity politics, this one versus that one. My understanding of this problem is this: precisely because the working class is not organized politically and ideologically in this country, and you see that by the weakness of the AFL-CIO, for example. Not that it's unimportant and helps millions of workers, but it's tied to the Democratic Party, and it's conservative, and its culture is bureaucratic. It sees no independent path for itself. Sometimes it seems like almost an appendage to the capitalist system. That is an unnatural state, it's a temporary state, because the working class and its organizations should be not only antagonistic to capitalism, they should be seeking to do away with it. Because the working class movement is weak, and a part of that weakness is that it does not embrace in a serious way the struggle against white supremacy and racism, for example, the struggle for women's liberation, the struggle of, of lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people who are sex workers, and who perhaps more than anyone else are victims of police terror, murder, and violence. They don't, the labor movement, especially at the top echelons, they don't embrace these struggles and say, these are not separate struggles. These are more than movements. These are working class struggles. A strong, serious working class organization or movement would make that clear. What that means is that other philosophical and political forces in broad society, after a while, tend to have more influence on some of these struggles. Not only bourgeois elements, but maybe even in a more complicated way, petty bourgeois elements. Um, you could say that in some respects, and I'm not, a foe of academia. You get a lot of revolutionary writers coming out of academia, especially when they break with, wanting to get rich and have a comfortable life and, sort of sell their soul for that purpose. So, academia is fine, especially radical academia that's being pushed further and further to the working class. But where the leadership and influence in the struggles against white supremacy and racism and these other issues should be coming from the working class and its organizations, be they the trade unions or working class parties and organizations. Instead, it's coming from academia. It's coming from outside of the working class. It's coming from social forces that are not really all that anti-capitalist or anti-capitalist even in a small way. And we should not be surprised by that, because the political struggle abhors a vacuum. If the working class, if the radical revolutionary working class does not do what's necessary to make these struggles against oppression its own and make them different fronts in the working class struggle, then somebody else, usually from another class, is going to come and own them. And I don't consider this to be the fault of a lot of young people who are inspired by the struggle against white supremacy, racism, and fascism. Those people are heroes out in the streets by the millions, not just in this country, everywhere, in response to the lynching of George Floyd. It's not their fault. It is the fault of a weak labor movement that is too tied to capitalism and the capitalist parties. The question is, does it have to be that way? And I believe emphatically it does not have to be that way. And I hope I get a chance to talk a little bit about how things can change and how things are already changing.
That is the perfect segue, comrade, because out of that, I wanted to ask you, in your article, you mentioned workers' assemblies. And I think this is getting at, the core question, that we're discussing today. And in your article is like, what can we do? And as you mentioned, this is not only a question of what can a class do, but how do we build our class as a force, as a class, despite this long history of sort of racism in the labor movement, the sort of stereotypical white working person. How do workers? Well, first of all, what are workers' assemblies? and how are they going to help us navigate these divisions within our class, and to unite against a somewhat divided and in some ways weak working class?
Well, our party, as well as many others, going to be talking about the conception of workers' assemblies, workers' defense assemblies, workers' assemblies against racism and fascism, workers' assemblies around all the issues, workers' assemblies to fight COVID-19, workers' assemblies to fight for a better contract in an industry, workers' assemblies to fight to end the incarceration of incarcerated workers. Prisoners are, in fact, incarcerated workers. Before even talking about what a workers' assembly is or could be, because that's something that has to be developed. The first thing to be understood is that the reason why we would call something a workers' assembly, I mean, what is an assembly? Assembly is a meeting, big, small, in between. Instead of, let's say, a people's assembly, there's nothing wrong with that. We've been involved with people's assembly. It's because it is our view that at this critical moment, when we're entering into depression-like conditions in terms of unemployment and evictions, and soon there'll be cuts at the state and local levels, hundreds of thousands of workers are going to lose their job. I think the airlines just announced they're going to lay off more than 30,000 workers. It's important that everyone who is struggling against this begin to see themselves as a worker. We must broaden the definition of who's a worker. A worker doesn't have to be someone who has a job or a certain kind of job. A worker is not simply someone who works with their hands in a factory. A worker is also someone who teaches for a living, or someone who is a healthcare worker with lots of education so they can do their job well, or a doctor. Workers work in offices. They do all kinds of what they used to call white collar jobs. Workers are also unemployed. We got a lot of unemployed people, and we're going to be getting more and more of them. Homeless people are workers. A lot of young people, perhaps the biggest new section of society that's entering the working class, not only here but around the world, is because whereas a lot of young people may have got their college degrees and are even in higher levels of education, going after a PhD, they were doing this so they can have a professional career, either in academia or somewhere else, and make a good living. The fact of the matter is, the development of capitalism has closed the door on a lot of people who are very educated, and they find that what they have is hundreds of $50 to $100,000 in debt, but all they can find is a gig job. All they can find is a gig job, or maybe a job working in Whole Foods, or working, at a coffee shop somewhere, and they find themselves having to move out of their apartments every 3 months because they can't afford the rent. These are part of the newest members of the working class. And one of the reasons, it's a very important reason, why we decided to push the conception of organizing workers' assemblies, because we want to influence the way that people think about themselves. Some people think I'm not in a class. Actually, it makes them feel more isolated and more hopeless. At least if they realize that they're part of a class, and then on top of that, when they get the understanding that that class could be a revolutionary class, it may not be that right now, but has the potential to be a revolutionary class, then it's like, wow, I am attached to something. I'm not just out there, flying in the wind. I'm attached to something very important that if I help it move in a militant anti-capitalist socialist direction, I can actually make some good out of my life. So that's part of it. It's to expand exponentially the conception of who is in the working class. We were talking about this earlier. Karl Marx explained in a number of his writings, including the Communist Manifesto, that as capitalism enters its final phase of decay, it will push larger sections of society, meaning people who either used to be well off or hope it would be well off because of the color of their skin, because of their family, or because they attained higher education, which used to be the ticket to a better life, finding out that it doesn't work anymore. So these people are being pushed into the proletariat, pushed into the working class. And Marx saw this as a contradictory dialectical sign that revolutionary times are coming, because what's happening, working class is winning over, it's already big, just like they used to say during Occupy Wall Street, the 99%. Well, that's one of the reasons why we're the 99%, because our class is getting bigger and bigger. Hopefully, the workers' assemblies, if helpful, will help tell everyone they're part of a class, from migrant workers, undocumented, who also don't feel welcome into the working class, certainly not for the most part into organized labor. And of course, are very vulnerable because of their situation. Uh, and African American youth, who are the primary targets of police and their guns and police killings. Uh, all of this, all of these sectors of society need to come together. And they need to come together and find some way merging with some kind of fusion with the organized labor movement, through struggles, through engaging the organized labor movement, uh, not through listening to the leadership of the organized labor movement, because the organized labor movement leadership is too bureaucratic, too conservative. No, what we need to do, those of us who are technically on the outside of the organized labor movement, we need to take a turn into the labor movement, kind of force ourselves into it. Okay, unions, what are you doing for the homeless? What are you doing for the unemployed? No, I've never been in a union, but what are you going to do for me? You say you're fighting for working people. I'm a worker. What's happened recently is a number of unions have come out very strongly for engaging in work stoppages against racism. And I'll tell you why. Because some of these unions are embarrassed. They're embarrassed that the AFL-CIO did not do much to support this glorious rebellion all around the world in May and June and July and August and even now. And so they see the problem, and they want labor to be organizing work stoppages with the Black Lives Matter. One of the things we're going to be doing in New York is calling a workers' assembly against racism, where we try to get forces from the Black Lives Matter and forces from the labor movement to come together and say, hello, how can we work together? And how can we on the outside, technically, of the labor movement become a source of pressure on the labor movement, especially the top layers of it, to engage in work stoppages and strikes and even general strikes. And if you look at the math realistically, you can see that things are in our favor. The organized labor movement's very big and very powerful and has resources that some of us don't have, but it represents less than 10% of the working class. So what are we saying? The overwhelming majority of a working class that is growing because more people are being pushed into it. Most of them are outside, not inside, outside the organized labor movement. We've got to do things that shake up the organized labor movement and remind them of this literal fact, so that they welcome us not as just people who sit at the table take marching orders, but people whom they listen to. I think actually that as the fusion of the organized labor movement and those who are in the working class but don't know it, their struggle, pressure labor, I think that Black Lives Matter movement, particularly the more militant sections of it, will become a material pressure inside the labor movement, pushing it to the left, pushing it in a militant direction, pushing it in an anti-capitalist direction. It may not happen overnight, but things are changing now because conditions are changing. And I think that in a broad stroke, something like what I described has got to be our strategy.
Thank you for that, comrade. And I thought your point about, feeling like you're a part of something was very powerful, especially right now. And I mean, the normal isolation of capitalism and the normal alienation of capitalism is, especially, in the gig economy, in the sort of, as capital becomes more immaterial, we don't even, a lot of us don't even have actual workplaces in which we can connect with people. This idea of being part of something larger than yourself, and then through these assemblies actually making those connections. I mean, I know personally, just organizing has been such a weirdly like spiritually helpful thing during this pandemic. Yeah, I thought that was very powerful. Helpful thing. So a quick announcement before we move on. I think we're actually just going to go right into questions from the audience because we have a few good ones. But before we do that, if you are interested in getting involved in struggles like these, like some of the ones Larry has mentioned, we encourage you to join Workers' World Party. You can go to workers.org/join to learn more, and we'll reach out. Additionally, we will begin printing Workers' World newspaper again on a monthly basis starting on October 15th. We had suspended the physical production of the paper due to COVID concerns, but we will be restarting this, and this will be a great tool to put in the hands of our class. And we're also excited about continuing our free subscription program for incarcerated members of our class, which is a big part of why we want to be printing this paper. And also to learn more about our paper and how to subscribe, you can also go to workers.org. We also want to encourage you to donate to Workers' World Party so we can keep growing our audience and continue to bring our class together. You can donate at workers.org/donate or on Venmo at Workers World. And if you like this conversation, you can also check out our new book, which is What Road to Socialism, and you can buy it online or download a copy for free at workers.org/books. So we have a few questions from the audience that are very helpful. The first one is from Kevin, which asks, are workers' assemblies the equivalent to Soviet councils or rank and file committees that another party has been pushing for and forming?
I think that in the formation of workers' assemblies, ultimately, you have to be moving in the direction of a Soviet and of a movement of workers' assemblies that can, if it is successful and strong enough, challenge capitalism and the capitalist system's government at every level for power and be instruments of dual power, many ways similar to the Soviets. It may not begin that way. Workers' assemblies may take root in the workplace. There's no reason why they can't have a workers' assembly in McDonald's, or at a Starbucks, or at an Amazon factory, or at a Whole Foods place, or on campus. Students are workers for the most part. Maybe they weren't, generations ago, especially if they were at some prestigious Ivy League university, but they are now. They owe a lot of money. Workers' assemblies does not just denote an organization. It's also a meeting, something that you could call what we used to call a meeting, but we call it a workers' assembly because, like I said before, it influences the way people think about themselves. Uh, Workers' assemblies could be organized on a regional level, on a very local level, on a neighborhood level. There is already in existence Southern Workers Assembly, Durham, North Carolina Workers Assembly. Uh, there are certain reasons that have a lot to do with the conditions for the working class in the South and in North Carolina that made those workers' assembly possible. There are different conditions in different parts of the country. There could be a workers' assembly for gig workers who are trying to organize, even though their work, the conditions for their work, is so precarious that it's very hard. And because it is precarious, unfortunately, for the most part, the organized labor movement believes that a lot of gig workers are not organizable, just like they believe a lot of fast food workers are not organizable, just like they believe a lot of very low wage workers can't be organized. And this is part of the problem. Uh, we can't we can't match what organized labor can do in terms of organizing workers. They have tremendous resources, but it is clear that if we're going to begin to organize the majority of the working class, which, as I said, is outside of the official organized labor movement, then we're going to have to create our own movement that is not against, not separate and apart from, not antagonistic to, uh, but in addition to the labor movement, because the labor movement is not doing it. They will do it as they change. There'll be pressure at every level for them to do it. So it's not a linear situation. It's not a static situation. And some unions are doing it now. Uh, Actually, those of us who are interested in this start doing it and have some success, among other things, that will put pressure on the organized labor movement to do it. Uh, there may be a workers' assembly of the unemployed. This is good in two respects. The unemployed is going to be a growing section, unfortunately, because we're heading into depression level, 1930s level unemployment. Not just temporary, not just when COVID-19 is, somehow resolved, but permanent, you know, double-digit depression level unemployment. So the organizing of the unemployed to fight for their rights, to fight for existence, things they need, a roof over their head. There could be a workers' assembly for the unemployed. And the second good thing about that is that it's another form of how you feel isolated and like you're worthless and like you're just hovering out there in space when you get unemployed because it's like at a job and now you're not even getting an income. It's almost like for a while the fact that you can't put food on your table and don't have a roof over your head, uh, that's painful. It also feels painful every time you wake up every morning and say, who am I? I don't even have a job. I haven't had a job for a year. And there's no possibility. What we're telling the unemployed is that you are part of our class. You may not have a job, but you're part of our class. And I'll tell you, I'm just thinking out loudly. Maybe what some workers' assemblies can do is make food, mutual aid for those who have been evicted, for those who are made homeless. Maybe in some neighborhoods, we can provide food and other, basic necessities, and organize other revolutionary elements to join the workers' assemblies for the precise purpose of helping to feed people. Let me say, I don't think that we can, respond to the crisis of hunger and all the deprivation that capitalist crisis the capitalist crisis is going to impose on our class. But the mutual aid, most certainly, certain points is going to be a part of that. But that mutual aid will not be alone. Well, that's all we're doing. It'll be part of the demonstration. It'll be part of the occupation. It'll be part of the marches. It'll be part of the political movement that we're organizing. Um, Before I forget it, and looking at the time factor, I'd like to say something about how working class got to the place that it's at. But I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you for that, comrade. So initially, I think we were going to try to end at 9, but we have a number of very helpful questions. This next one I have, you sort of answered, but I want to put it out there in case you wanted to add anything. And it is it's a sort of a larger question that, we're going to have to develop and struggle. But Mayana asked, how specifically do we integrate people who are not in unions into the labor movement, especially if their jobs don't really create an opportunity for unionizing or don't pay them at all, say stay-at-home parents or people who work on commission? And like I said, you sort of, gave an answer to this, but I just wanted to put it out in case you had anything to add.
Well, the first thing is that we have to part company in terms of agreeing with the organized labor movement on who and how you organize people. Unfortunately, with the organized labor movement, there may be exceptions here or there. UE, maybe a few other unions. I know 1 or 2 Teamsters unions that have different orientations, but for the most part, it's like we want to organize workers in the traditional way, get a majority of the workers at a workplace, get a contract, just like we've been doing for decades now. But there are some large and growing sections of our class where that's not their reality. They can't get a contract anytime in the near future, if ever, from an employer for lots of reasons. They're too small, laws in various places. Actually, the laws on the federal level, and I think for the most part on the state level, there may be a few exceptions. I think California may have changed their laws on organizing gig workers. It makes it very difficult. Well, these are not workers. These are, what do they call them? They come up with other words. Well, you're not really a worker. So therefore the NLRB does not apply to you. You're an associate, or you're this or that. We have to build a movement that is prepared to do what organized labor is not prepared to do. But at the same time, we also have to go inside the organized labor movement and sit down with some of these leaders, some of whom are better than others, and say, what's wrong with you? Why do you have such a narrow view of who should be in a union? Don't you know that this is helping capitalism, not the working class? Don't you think you should change? I mean, we understand that, first and foremost, you have to see after your members and their grievances and their contract and so forth. But if you're just concerned with a small number of workers in an industry, capitalism will just chop us up and divide us. This is not just about some kind of, altruism. If you want to defend your union, if you want to keep your workers unionized, you better take a bigger interest in the circumstances of other workers. And as far as organizing, organize what works. Organize with a template, the basis that works. If you can't get a contract, does that mean you can't organize? It doesn't make sense to me. You're saying, well, we can't get a contract, so therefore the workers shouldn't organize. You'd be telling the workers in North Carolina, for example, which is a right to work state, they don't recognize unions, private and government. You'd be telling the workers in North Carolina, sorry, We can't get a contract. We can't get collective bargaining, which we're used to here in some other state. So therefore, we can't. Good luck. We can't organize you. We have to say, and this is what the workers' assemblies say. This is what the UE says in North Carolina. We will organize workers under any circumstances and situation. Of course, it would be better if they could win a contract, if they could have collective bargaining. But just because they can't, that means that we're not going to organize them. It makes no sense whatsoever. Same thing is true for migrant workers, who all too often unions don't pay much attention to. A big problem. So, because they got problems that make it difficult to organize them in some traditional way, we're just going to say, good luck. Same thing for the unemployed or the homeless. Well, good luck. I'll put $1 in a bucket for them. These are parts of our class that have to be organized. We're not saying that this is going to be easy. And I don't like to go back in history. Things change, and the world is a lot different in 2020 than it was in 1932. But I'll say this, the ball that got the struggles of that tremendous decade of struggle in the U.S. rolling was when the Communist Party helped to organize the unemployed. That had influence on industrial workers in other parts of the country, working for auto, working for steel, and other industrial industries. That inspired them to organize Ford and GM, United Steel, and hold sit-ins. It started not with workers, but with unemployment councils.
That's definitely helpful. And I mean, that's such a, it's a huge challenge and a huge question. But I think, something that's helpful that came out of your comments is just, we at least have to try. If we say, well, these members of our class, cannot organize, we're defeating our cause before we even attempt it. And in some ways, given the isolation and everything, especially, sort of the desperate, and, really just the despair people are feeling in this moment, that's sometimes, I think, a bigger hurdle, than we might imagine. It's just that will to fight.
Mm-hmm.
So that was definitely helpful.
That's important.
It is, and it's not, we should never take it for granted. It's hard to wake up every day and fight, in this system. So there's another question we have from Patty. Is it the time to vote against Trump and the growing fascist tendency that Trump is encouraging?
That's a challenging question. We are not for the Democratic Party. We do not support Biden and Harris. But the reason why we wouldn't spend time going around campaigning against them is because we understand that tens of millions of workers feel that the only way that they can stop Trump is to vote for the Democrats. That's a reality. It's a reality until there's a genuine basis changing that, meaning that the workers have another alternative, either with respect to the electoral struggle or with respect to what I believe is the more important, broader struggle in the streets, to win things like healthcare and better wages and rights for the unemployed and an end to eviction, and to racism and so forth, so on. So we understand why many in our class will try to vote Trump out. We understand that, and we don't have a quarrel with them around that. If there's anyone that we have a quarrel with, it's those on the left who on one hand say that they're socialists and they're anti-capitalists. And they have some notion of a new society sooner than later, a socialist society, but who then return to, we've got to vote for the lesser of two evils, and get trapped inside the Democratic Party, which we believe is an unrepentant institution that represents the interests of capitalism, of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie. And our argument is with them. There's no future with the Democratic Party. The thing is to work hard to develop the alternative to the working class, to the Democratic Party. And when you talk about the fear of fascism, this is germane to this question. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Trump loses, Biden gets in, and there'll people will, oh, well, we got rid of Trump, right? But if the terrible conditions for the working class prevail, not only prevail, but get worse as we sink deeper and deeper into a depression, but the Democratic Party that now runs the government, as it did when Clinton was in office, as it did when Obama was in office, really just shrugs off the demands for the right to a job, the right to an income, a decent income, right to food, the right to housing, all the things that people need. And it loses a lot of the working class on that basis. And the working class becomes disillusioned with it. You then begin creating the basis, the opening for another attempt by a racist, white supremacist movement. Maybe some of the forces that are neo-fascist right now, or maybe new forces. But that'll always be a danger when capitalism is falling apart, when it is declining on one hand, and there is tremendous suffering, but there is no struggle on the part of the working class to rise up to changing the conditions or changing the system through revolution.
Great, thank you for that, comrade. So we have one final question, and then we're going to wrap up. This one is from Teresa El Amin, and this is a really good question, and there's a lot to talk about. The question is, the socialist left is in disarray with many splits and dissolutions over the past few years. Larry Holmes called for a united front of the socialist left. What is your thinking on the potential of unity among socialists with interest in advancing the working class?
I hope, and how you doing, Sister Teresa? I actually know Sister Teresa for many, many years, and I'm glad that she could join us. She's a fighter in the Black liberation movement and other things for many, many years. Many of us know her and love her. I am for, our party is for, and we hope other individuals and other left parties will reconsider, especially in these dire, difficult times where there's a lot of trouble, but there's also a lot of opportunities for revolutionary socialist forces, that they will consider how can a big step be taken forward towards socialist unity. I don't believe this will require organizations agreeing on everything up and down the line. But I do agree that there'll probably be some fundamental things, reviving the class struggle, the importance of fighting white supremacy, racism, what we used to call the national question, an aversion to believing that anything to do with the Democratic Party can somehow help the workers and the oppressed. We've got to do that. What happens after many, many decades of the left and the working class being weak and demoralized, it's a contradiction where anyone who's trying to be objective, they look at the weaknesses on the left and they say, Why are there so many groups? It doesn't. I mean, you're weak enough. I mean, and you're not trying to figure out how to come together. It doesn't. It's sort of, what's going on with that? You know, and a partial answer to that is that the weakness, especially when it has been around and persists for a long, long time, you know, you're wandering in the desert and it affects your morale. And if your morale is not what it should be, that is looking forward to the future, ready to open up a new chapter of the struggle, then you may not be ready to be part of unity. And, groups and leaders, when their morale is low because they've been through hell, they can find all sorts of excuses not to have unity. You did this to me 5 years ago. You had this position. You disrespected me. And everybody who's been in the movement as long as I have, they know what I'm talking about. People not burying hatchets. There was a big blowout. There was a big split 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 10 years ago, and I don't even talk to that person, Larry Holmes or Teresa Alameen. No, and this kind of dominates, the psychology and the morale of the situation. I don't know what can be done about that. I do hope that as the struggle from beneath grows, the unemployed, the workers, the anti-racist struggle, and we all begin to see the potential that pushes us in the direction for unity. And we realize that the working class movement, the revolutionary forces are indeed very small, but we could do a lot better if we found some bases to come together. Maybe the workers' assemblies might provide that basis. I think it's something to be considered.
Awesome. Thank you so much, comrade. In the chat, there's another link to join Workers' World Party if you enjoyed the discussion tonight. Thank you, Larry, for this wonderful and enriching discussion, and thank you for everybody who watched and put in questions and helped us round out this really thought-provoking discussion.
Is there any chance of I can make a small point? I wanted to make it, but I forgot about it, and the questions were so good. Maybe we can do this for another webinar. But it's important that people understand how the conservatism of the labor movement became such a big problem. And it goes back to things that happened in the 30s. U.S. imperialism becoming so strong at the end of World War II. The victory of fascism over the working class in Europe. The U.S. solving some of its problems in terms of meeting the needs of the workers by imperialist war, the witch hunt, and then years of relative stability for the capitalist system. I don't want to say more than that, but especially for younger radicals, at the proper time, we should go over this because the working class movement used to be revolutionary. Their goal used to be revolution, not reform. They used to be more internationalist than they are. Now the conditions are coming that were like it was, 90 years ago or, during the time of the Russian Revolution. It's almost like we're going back in time in a sense, but it's not completely like that because there's so many ways 2020 is different. But my point is that we should review what happened as part of considering, can these problems that have made the leadership of the working class so conservative, can they be overcome? And can the working class once again become militant, internationalist, and revolutionary?
Absolutely, that's a very strong point to end on, and will leave us with a lot to think about. So again, thank you everybody. You can tune in next week, same time, same place, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, for another weekly Workers World webinar. And in the meantime, of course, build a workers' world.